Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. Dear audience, welcome to today's episode in our series BerlinTalks. On behalf of Freie Universität Berlin, it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's session. We are coming to you from the plenary chamber of the Academic Senate at Freie Universität Berlin. And so on behalf of the university and on behalf of the two sponsoring programs, FUBiS and FUBiS, it is my pleasure to welcome you all to today's session, where our topic will be sustainability from buzzword to guiding principle. Just a brief word about the two sponsoring programs. The FUBiS program, the European Studies program, at which I serve as academic director, is a semester-based program with a fall and spring semester involving German language as well as subject courses across a wide variety of subject fields. The FUBiS program is the university's summer and international summer and winter university. It has 3 sessions during the year, 1 session in January and 2 sessions during the summer months. And so these two programs have joined together during these unusual times to launch this online series of discussions, of panel discussions, bringing together different experts to look at different topics. Across the months, we have different sessions. We will have another one in April, another one in June, and so on it goes through this year. Just a couple of announcements also for our audience. We are recording this event, but your identity is hidden. So you are, as audience members, anonymous. Furthermore, as audience members, you are invited to use the chat function to submit comments and questions. And then hopefully in the course of our session, we will have a chance to have the panel members address some of these issues or questions that you raise. With that, let me briefly introduce the topic and then our panel. If you were to ask people to compose a list of buzzwords or terms that seem to be frequently used, maybe almost too frequently used, probably sustainability would be one of them these days that would end up on that list. And so that is a reason why we decided to take a closer look at this concept, and perhaps also behind this discussion raised the question whether the use of the term has become somewhat inflationary, so that it's used so much that perhaps the true meaning of it gets lost at times. When we think of sustainability, we think of things environmental, because that's the context where it is most frequently used. The question of balance, of being able to survive as humanity, as species here on the planet, in terms of our use of resources and how we deal with our surroundings in terms of our economic and socioeconomic life. So it is a proliferating use beyond that. We have all kinds of sustainable phenomena these days. And so our panel members will be taking us through various aspects of this concept. And with that, let me introduce the panel members for tonight. Nora Grosse works here at Freie Universität Berlin, and she is a project coordinator regarding sustainability in teaching in the Unit for Sustainability and Energy Management here at the university. She studied European Studies at Maastricht University and International Development and Sustainability at Sciences Politiques in Paris and at Freie Universität Berlin. After her work as a campaigner and researcher on global development and social rights in several non-governmental organizations, foundations, and think tanks, she now integrates inter- and transdisciplinary perspectives into her teaching and coordination concerning sustainability at the university here through a variety of projects. Her vision is for everyone at the university and beyond to have access to high quality higher education for sustainable development. Then we're joined by Heike Mewes. She studied political science at Freie Universität Berlin and at the Università di Bologna in Italy. She has more than 7 years of work experience supporting sustainable business strategies, management and reporting, as well as sustainability entrepreneurship. During her appointments with the Berlin-based think tanks Adelphi, the Institute for Ecological Economy Research, and BSD Consulting, she implemented national and international research and consulting projects, training programs, conferences, dialogue events, and entrepreneurship awards in these above-mentioned areas. Today, she works as a freelance consultant, researcher, trainer, and facilitator. She has manifold teaching experience, both with company representatives and students in the FUBiS program, for example, and also as teacher and facilitator on sustainable business strategies and entrepreneurship. Anje Anzegir specializes in the topic of European integration with a focus on global and European energy and climate policy, as well as social movements. Currently, he holds the position of Senior Energy and Climate Policy Expert at Climate Analytics in Berlin. He has been an instructor in the FUBiS and FUBiS programs for several years, and also teaches European environmental social movements at the Berlin subsidiary of New York University. As a member of the Scientists for Future, he's able to contribute to the discussion about climate change mitigation in Poland and Germany. In his PhD dissertation, he analyzed the implementation of European renewable energy directives in Poland. Part of his research was done while working for the Executive Agency for Competitiveness and Innovation of the European Commission. And our fourth guest is Patricia Heidegger. Patricia is Director for Global Policies and Sustainability at the European Environmental Bureau, EEB, Europe's largest federation of citizens' environmental organizations. In other words, a very large non-governmental organization headquartered in Brussels. She has been working as an advocate for environmental justice, human rights, and sustainable development nearly 20 years, mainly with NGOs in Europe and Asia. At the EEB, she follows intergovernmental environmental processes at regional and UN levels. With regard to the so-called Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, about which we will hear more today, she's part of the steering group of SDG Watch Europe and closely monitors the implementation of the SDGs in and by the European Union. She supervises projects on environmental democracy, the economic transition, and on EU enlargement. She's a member of the board of European Movement International and teaches at the Brussels School of Journalism and Communication on public interest representation. Patricia has a background in political science and also has a degree in international human rights law. So I welcome our panel, and we will now first turn to a few slides to give you a bit of an introduction to tonight's topic. Green imagery comes to you on the first slide, and when we go to the next slide, what we will see is this notion of the Sustainable Development Goals, which play a central role, particularly also at the United Nations. And this is a well-known depiction of these goals, and you can see here the 17 goals, everything from poverty and hunger, life on land, life below water, and so on. We will leave the slide on for just a moment so you can, as audience, take a look at these. Some of you may be familiar with this image because you frequently see it in media. For others, it may be new. So we leave it for just a moment so you can see what these goals encompass. And then we go on. And we see that here is a suggestion to look at sustainability from a different set of angles. One angle is the so-called priority model, and that is to say human beings pursue different goals in policy, and where do the priorities lie? In what rank order does sustainability come up as a goal, competing perhaps with others, for example, economic growth or technological innovation that may not be environmentally so sound, whatever the case may be there. Then global goals, that is what we just saw, the idea that these sustainability goals are a global phenomenon, ultimately, that it really concerns all of us on this planet. A further way to look at it is to differentiate the global, the national, and the regional and local level. So what do people do? And of course, that will be tonight playing a role as well. When we hear about, for example, the university here, what is done on a grassroots, on a local level here at an institution. Another aspect of sustainability is the time perspective. Also when it comes to policy. The consequences of what we do as human beings today in this year or in the last few years or the coming few years have implications across history to come, time to come for future generations. So an intergenerational understanding and a time framing of the notion of sustainability is suggested there. And then a multi-layer approach to say, okay, we have to look at this on the individual level, for example, our consumption habits, but also on a societal and a political level. So you see there's already different ways of coming at this issue. We then go on and we see that one way this is also sometimes presented is through concentric circles, where the core of things is economic, and then there's a societal dimension, but what wraps all around it on the outside and really encompasses everything that's within it is the environment. Another way of looking at it is sustainability as an intersection type of concept, where we see an example here. You see planet, people, profit. So profit suggests business, economics. Planet, the environment, our habitat as humanity, human beings, plus of course everything else that's alive on this planet. And then people, so society, our organized way of being. And we have a few more like that, because this is the simple way of looking at it, perhaps. And then if we look at the next one, these intersections start to become more complicated. These spheres, the social, the economic, the environmental, are being fleshed out here, with certain aspects being specified more clearly. But once again, like the previous slide, what's going on here is that different dimensions of life, of existence, meet around the concept here of sustainability. And we have one more like that. You see there's more and more text. I'm showing you different examples that are available through the internet, different research projects and so on. Here there's the talk of the 5 Ps: people, prosperity, partnership, peace, and planet. So once again, the idea that we have multiple dimensions in existence that interact in the area of sustainability or sustainable development. And then I have one more slide, and this, depending on how big your screen is, I don't know how well you can see this, but the Sustainable Development Goals are often talked about. But in 2019, for the World Economic Forum, the Ipsos company, a public opinion research company, went around the world and asked people to what extent they were actually familiar with this concept of SDGs, of Sustainable Development Goals. And what you can see here is that on average of the countries that were surveyed, about a quarter or so of the respondents were somewhat or completely familiar with these SDGs. And you can see also that only a handful of countries had a majority of respondents familiar. India, Turkey, which personally surprised me a little bit, China, and also perhaps surprisingly Saudi Arabia scored over 50% response in terms of familiarity. Countries like Italy, France, Japan, Great Britain, in other words, well-developed Western-style countries or capitalist modern economies, industrial economies, scored lower. So this might be a bit sobering to think of the fact that we're talking about a concept here with sustainable development goals that may not be as well known. On the other hand, that confirms then that it's a good idea to have today's panel and to look at this, because there's then an educational purpose to be served. So with that, I would like to now turn to our panel. And the first question is being asked of all four, and they're going to give you their perspective based on their own professional background and where they are active. It's sort of like where you stand depends on where you sit in this case. And that is, what is their understanding of the word, of the concept sustainability in a definitional kind of sense. We will go from the local up. So I will begin with Nora Grosse and ask her to speak first about her understanding of this term.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you also for providing some of the informational background already. Well, from my perspective, and this might, be a personal perspective, I hope also our team's perspective, but of course I don't want to claim to speak for everyone. I would really personally like to draw the attention to the not only the different dimensions. Of course, I think they show, and also the SDGs show that it's not just about ecological crises that we need to solve, but these are deeply interconnected with issues of global justice, social equality, and individual well-being as well. So in the end, it's not really the planet that has a problem, but us humans who depleted the planet and are still going to be dependent on its resources for our survival. So for me, actually, concepts like the Anthropocene or planetary boundaries, 3 of which we have transgressed, are also very helpful concepts in understanding that we actually have absolute ecological limits in which all human activity needs to take place. And another concept that I think neatly combines this is Kate Raworth's concept of a donut economy, where you kind of, us as humanity, need to live within the donut. So the kind of foundation is a socioeconomic foundation, of course, where all these issues of social and economic and also political well-being are met, but within the absolute ecological limits.
Thank you, Nora. I would like then to turn to Heike, who comes, as we will see later on, from the point of view, of course, also of entrepreneurship and business, but in a more general sense. Heike, give us a sense, give the audience a sense how you conceive of this term sustainability.
Yeah, thank you, first of all, for having me. And I can tie in very closely with Nora very directly. Maybe on a very general level, I would say, to me, it's really a guiding principle, a concept that guides our action, where I would say it's to act in a way that allows current and future generations to lead a decent life on this planet. And there we have the decent life, which also covers all our basic human needs and human rights, but also the limits of the planet. And I also use a lot and like a lot the image of the donut, where we bring together these 2 perspectives and where we can focus on a space that we need to hold, kind of the sweet spot between these ecological limits that we shouldn't transgress, but building on and assuring the basic human needs and rights of everyone. So I think this basic understanding is not specific to my background and my focus on economics, but then how this translates into business context is still another question, and I'm sure we will dig deeper into that later on.
Thank you, Heike. I would like to then ask Patricia, coming to us from Brussels, to give us a sense. When you hear the word sustainability, what are the connotations for you?
Yeah, hello, good evening, everyone. Very pleased to be with you. So, well, I guess it's not very different from what the two other speakers have already shared. As you've mentioned at the very beginning, I mean, obviously sustainability is about a very existential question. It's about how can we ensure human well-being for all and globally, and also for future generations, while respecting the ecological limits that the planet is setting for us. In short, it's about living well within the limits of the planet. And as the others have mentioned, we also refer very often to the concept of a safe operating space for us as humankind, and the planetary boundaries, the 9 planetary boundaries that creates that limitation to the safe operating space. So that's a concept we also work with a lot. So, for instance, we work on chemical pollution and deforestation and climate change, obviously. So that's a concept we use a lot, and we also work a lot with the donut economy concept. So that's one that has become very popular. And just recently, we also had a discussion with Kate Raworth on the link between her concept and European environmental policy. So it's the same concepts that we're using. And you also mentioned the Sustainable Development Goals, which is also a framework that we refer to a lot. And I think the one of the interesting aspects behind the concept of the SDGs is that it's a very holistic approach, and it shows us how everything is interrelated. So that, for instance, we cannot solve environmental problems with very isolated environmental solutions, but we have to make the interlinkages between the different dimensions. So that's a concept we also refer to. And finally, for us, sustainability is also very closely linked to a question of human rights. So, of course, human rights to life and human right to health, adequate standard of living, etc., but also human right to a healthy environment, which is still an emerging human right. So for us, sustainability is also very closely linked to questions of human rights.
Thank you, Patricia. And then to round out our opening perspective, Anže, when you teach in our program and the question of sustainability comes up and a student says, okay, Dr. Anzigier, what do you mean by that? What would you answer?
I mean, I would probably add or answer most of what you've just said, but just to add to that, for me personally, sustainability is also to keep the quality of life within the limits set by the natural capital, by nature. And we take so much from nature as society, but also as economy, that we all often fail to realize it. And as a result, we, as was mentioned, cross numerous borders so that the natural capital has been used so much that it just cannot recover. So sustainable life and sustainable economy or sustainable society is one that doesn't take so much, doesn't exceed the limits, or doesn't overdraw the account that we have at Nature Bank, and even recovers this natural capital so that future generations can enjoy or even increase their quality of life and their welfare.
Thank you, Anže. We're now going to go back again, recycle, so to speak, almost, back to the local level and back to Nora. Now that we have gotten some opening indications as to what this term sustainability involves. Nora, could you introduce the work that you and the others in your team do here at the university? Sustainability as applied to the university, some opening perspectives here. You're part of a unit that deals with sustainability. Energy is one of the elements there. Give us a sense as to how that came about. When did that come into existence? Who else is there? What is your position within it? And how does the sustainability idea get applied here? Give some examples in the university context.
Okay, those are a lot of questions in one, but I'll try to keep it short. But I'll have to elaborate a bit. Well, the Sustainability and Energy Management Unit, how it's been called since 2014, was actually preceded by a long-term focus on rather energy management, and was part of the technical department at the university. So I think this kind of goes in line with the general understanding of sustainability or environmental management at that time. So basically, we've been active since 2000. And yeah, basically between 2000 and 2010 or 2014, energy management, energy efficiency were more or less the focus of our activities. Well, I wasn't there yet. So basically my colleagues, and things like waste management, anything that also I think the EU provides with its environmental management system was the focus. And then I think also with the kind of global move towards sustainable development and a really strategic approach that really tries to also break it down to the local level and to all kinds of institutions, a more strategic dimension came in. And I think the concept of a whole institution approach really summarizes this very well, because it basically means that, and that's our understanding, I think, you create really holistic learning environment in terms of sustainability. So you create a place where students are learning sustainability concepts and contents, but also methods and competencies that really make them conscious, reflecting, but also active citizens. And as well, of course, you go into the research dimension, where you try to enlarge and bring together different perspectives on how to actually solve multiple crises related to sustainability. And yeah, then of course you have the campus and the institution itself, where there's a lot of dimensions that can be addressed, from mobility to IT to energy management, building, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, so I don't know if for now suffices, or otherwise I can go on.
Thank you, Nora. Just a quick follow-up. If you have been there not the entire time with this unit that they have been in existence, but if you had to identify, let's say, a particular area as an example where you say that's where we have been successful so far, and where would you say has there been less success? Where is there more struggle, more obstacle to overcome? Can you give an illustration of each one?
Sure. Well, I think the big success story is definitely the energy efficiency programs and savings. So basically, FUB has been cutting down on energy consumption and also related CO2 emissions by almost 30%, in 27. And I think the related CO2 emissions are even more. So this is, in a way, I think in Germany, a kind of pioneering example, and they were also one of the first. And then I also think in terms of governance, it's quite unique that we're kind of very high up in the organizational hierarchy of FUB, because we're part of the presidency, so to say. And so the topic can really be addressed from a very strategic and all-encompassing dimension. And of course, also the appropriate resources can be there to implement projects. And I think in terms of challenges, well, I'm in part of trying to promote teaching, sustainability teaching at the university. And there, of course, you're very reliant on the different disciplines and the different departments of the university, where, of course, you have the principle in Germany of academic freedom. So you need to really enter into a discourse. You need to build networks with kind of more individual professors and teachers to really try to bring the issue forward, because obviously you can't force anyone to integrate sustainability issues into their seminars, for instance. So, I mean, I think we've definitely come a step forward there. For instance, we've made also a review for our sustainability report, where it showed that already 15% of all teaching courses addressed at least one of the SDGs. But of course, this is still very broad. And I think only 5 to 10% are really focusing on sustainability in their teaching. So I think there's still some room for improvement. And for research, the numbers are actually higher. So I think this is, let me check. I think it was around 35% of research projects who more or less address some of the issues of sustainability of the SDGs. So, but even there, of course, I would wish that we would have more of that in the future.
Thank you, Nora. Moving a little bit away from just the local to multiple dimensions in that regard would be when we turn to business. And I want to turn to Heike next. There's often this argument, economics and business versus sustainability, that they're somehow not compatible, or that the tradition is not there to think sustainably in terms of business. What is the situation in the business community? Do companies, do businesses increasingly take this seriously? Does it depend on their size? What's the scene, so to speak, in the business community when it comes to sustainability?
Well, difficult to answer as it's really diverse. So what we can maybe say as a general trend, I would definitely say that over the past years, there's a clear growing understanding among really the majority of businesses that sustainability is an issue that you have to address. It's not something you can do, but it's something that you have to look into. What are your impacts, especially now with the climate debate really becoming more to the forefront? What is your impact on the global climate, but also other issues, environmental issues, social issues? This has become really I would say mainstream to understand that you have to consider this, kind of find a position. Then to what extent you integrate that is really you find all kind of all approaches across the whole spectrum. You said there's no real tradition in sustainability in business. This actually, there have been discourses about the social responsibility of business that are really going back more than like to the Industrial Revolution, actually, and all the negative impacts then also on communities and workers where these issues already came up. The sustainability debate kind of merged with these discourses only like 20 years ago or so. And it started actually being focused on the environmental side, whereas the corporate social responsibility was more on the social side. Today, these discourses are quite merged. And there is a strong actually part of especially small and medium companies, especially family-owned companies, who have developed really strong sustainable business models. Then there's, if we look at the, let's say, big companies, big corporates, global players, they all deal and integrate sustainability, but at a different level, I would say. So there's still kind of like a tension between, in their understanding and interpretation, a tension between profitability, growth, in an economic sense, and to what extent to integrate sustainability concerns. But there's a growing understanding that these go hand in hand, especially with growing demands by the policy level and the financing sector. These are really important drivers at the moment, where companies understand that their profitability and their ability to draw investment will rely on how well they manage their risks and opportunities in this area. Heike,
is it your experience that sustainability as a concept resonates more with younger entrepreneurs than with older generations? That this is something, because as you say, it's part of a more recent discourse that younger, perhaps also startup companies are more attuned to this concept than perhaps people in the business field who've been around longer and who just, so to speak, did not quite grow up with this issue the way younger generations do.
Yeah, in a way, I can agree. What you can observe in Germany, for example, there's a tradition. There has been a tradition of the so-called ehrbarer Kaufmann, so the decent merchant, let's say. And a long time, actually, companies were a bit hesitant to pick up these discourses from other angles, like on corporate sustainability management, on CSR, corporate social responsibility, that came a bit from other, let's say, cultural backgrounds, other economic systems. And they would say, oh, we are doing this stuff. We have been doing this stuff for a long time. We have a strong tradition in Germany, for instance, also of integrating social concerns through the trade unions, our employee representatives, and we don't need kind of like other ways of addressing this. Still, I think, on the other hand, we have the entrepreneurs. I think it's right that younger people have grown up with these discourses about sustainability and have a different, quite informed understanding often of what this concept entails. So I see in the startup world that this is a concept that is taken up very with open arms. So it's been used a lot, and there's not that hesitancy to say, oh, this is a concept we might not need. Of course, it's a bit fluffy, and you have to really look into how you translate that in your business model. But there's not, let's say, some kind of real hesitancy. However, now I would say in the companies that start dealing with these issues, all the standards, all the frameworks that you can use as a company, they have this wording sustainability in them, or sustainable development goals, sustainability standards, and this has become by now quite well understood and commonplace.
Thank you very much, Heike. Now I'm going to shift to the European level with our two other guests, and I would like to turn to Anje first. As I said some minutes ago, Anje, I would like you to give us a bit of perhaps also historical perspective. How has sustainability as a concept informed the development of EU policy sort of over time? Can you give an indication as to perhaps definable stages or processes that have taken place, how the EU has come into a focus on sustainability in policy making? When did that start? How did that happen? What are some of the major stages that have taken place there?
Yes, indeed. The EU has underwent quite a strong development, evolution in the area of sustainability, and that began from some movements from national level. We have back in the 1970s, 1980s, the anti-nuclear movement. And in some cases, for example, in Denmark, in Germany, the idea was, we just cannot oppose to everything like nuclear power and coal power. You have to come up with an idea as well. So the idea was renewables. And you had actually farmers who started developing the first wind turbines, and very basic ones, but in the end, with some evolution, they did work quite well, and then this developed into a major industry. And just fast forward, the fact that sustainability can also mean economy and economic development and industry resulted in the European Commission and in some governments picking up on this point as well, so that sustainability became now, this is the surprising element and optimistic ones, one that we did not expect. Now sustainability and, for example, dealing with climate change is perceived as a way out of the economic crisis induced by the COVID crisis. So this is quite surprising, because we've been afraid, early 2020, so that in addition to the pandemic, we will also just forget about the other crisis, the climate crisis, just the way we've done in 2008, 2009. We had this wave of environmentalism 2007 and 2008 and 2009 was the lost time, and then 2011, 2010s lost decade for climate protection, with some exceptions. This hopefully will not be the case for this economic crisis and for this decade that just started. And just one last point on this one, obviously the role of the Fridays for Future, the role of the young people going on the street, demonstrating for their future, played a very important role, often much more important role than I was hoping with the case. I mean, my expectations were just exceeded in terms of the impact that kids had on the politics and policies, and rightly so.
Just picking up on this, we have a tendency to talk about Europe, European Union. Europe does this or that or sees it whatever way. And of course, we know on a daily basis that's actually not quite true. So to what extent can one argue that the growing attention to environmental issues and the integration of sustainability and environmental concerns in policymaking has been varied across Europe? Is there such a thing as a north-south contrast in Europe in that regard? Nordic countries perhaps being more environmentally active in policymaking than perhaps some of the Mediterranean countries? What about the post-communist development in the East? When it comes to environmental issues, is there a difference, a contrast between East and West? To what extent have those regional divergences played into this picture of policy development in Europe?
That's an excellent point. And one of the reasons why this question is very interesting is that I myself, coming from Poland, which also has a very different approach to sustainability than a number of different Western and Northern countries. But I would differentiate between countries and governments, because in the countries, the society, for example, has a very different approach to sustainability than their governments. And in Poland recently, over the last year or so, we had a revolution in terms of PV installations, the small solar energy installations for electricity generation. We had over 250,000 people installing those on their roofs in Poland. That's something that was surprising and positively in a positive way. Obviously, the government is still, in some regards, on another planet or in another time zone, something like 5 decades behind the society. But in Germany, in general, in the EU, yes, we do have the Nordic countries, which are much more ambitious, Western countries doing better than the East European countries. But now, as we realize that actually economic growth can be driven by sustainability, this disparity is changing quite rapidly. And just one last point, I would not say it's just disparity within the EU. We have a global climate movement. We have people going on the street demonstrating for climate protection around the world. So it's just not, East versus West. I would say it's society versus governments.
Okay, thank you. Patricia, you are spending most of your time in Brussels, right where the EU has its headquarters and where policy is made. There's often talk about this concept of a European Green Deal that the European Commission also talks about. Tell the audience a little bit more about what that involves and how the NGO, how the organization where you work is dealing with this concept as well and is monitoring and acting vis-a-vis the European Union as a monitoring and an activist organization in the environmental field.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, the fact that we have this European Green Deal and that it's been made the political priority of the European Commission now, has really been a major shift in political priorities, and it came really as a surprise, even to us in the environmental movement. And of course, as my colleague has said, this is of course an answer to, well, not just kind of growing awareness around sustainability questions, but also an answer to the so-called green wave in the last European elections, and of course also an answer to the youth protesting in the streets. So that's a very positive development from our perspective. Just to kind of compare a little bit, I mean, with the current European Commission, I mean, there's so many new environmental and climate policy files on the table. A lot of developments are possible now. A lot of things are being reopened and rediscussed, and there's new ambitions and new objectives. With the previous European Commission under President Juncker, for us as environmental organizations, the situation was totally different. We had to fight back against a European Commission that wanted to cut red tape and kind of cut down on environmental policies to make life easier for business. And now this has totally changed to a political situation where environmental and climate policies are really at the core of policy making at the European level. So from our perspective, obviously, that's a great development. And it's been very, very busy ever since for us, given that so many political files are on the table and so many things are happening. So we're very busy following all these developments and, of course, trying to shape them and trying to influence them. And we've been also very, I mean, we were already afraid that, you know, what we had won would be very quickly lost, given the onset of the pandemic last year. And as has been said before, I mean, so far, these new political priorities around sustainability have been quite resistant or resilient in the face of the pandemic. And so we're also quite pleased that in that context, sustainability and also the SDGs have been declared as kind of a compass for also the recovery measures, and that, for instance, 30% of the EU's budget are now earmarked for fighting climate change. I mean, obviously, we're arguing it should be more, but, you know, from a, let's say, a broader perspective, these are very, very positive developments. So just to kind of name, just since this new commission has taken office in December 2019, I mean, what we've seen is a new biodiversity strategy. We have seen a new climate law. We have seen a new chemical strategy. We have seen a new circular economy action plan, a farm to fork strategy, a hydrogen strategy, a methane strategy, and I mean, so many things are happening. So it's really an exciting time for people who work in environmental policies. Obviously, we're not happy with all of the things and all of the objectives. I mean, some things are, of course, you know, are not what we kind of are calling for. I mean, for instance, if you look at the climate targets of the EU, I mean, they don't follow what science is telling us, but at least the ambition is way higher than what we've seen before. So on the one hand, we're very pleased to see that sustainability has made it to the core of European policy making. But of course, there are also major blockers still in place that, you know, we are very busy fighting. I guess one very important thing to keep in mind is that there's a major problem around what is called policy coherence for sustainable development, which means you focus on sustainability in one policy area, but you have other policy areas where sustainability isn't really, you know, considered seriously. Just to give you one concrete example is that the EU has been working on a reform of the common agricultural policy for many years. And the reform of the agricultural policy is in no way aligned with the objectives of the European Green Deal in terms of climate change, in terms of reducing pollution, reducing water pollution, air pollution. There's a clash basically between sustainability policies in the EU and something like the common agricultural policy. So coherence between these different policies is a big issue. Another issue is that we're still very much focused in the EU on what's happening inside the EU and in our region, but we're not so good at kind of looking at the impact that we're having in other parts of the world. So so-called externalities or negative spillover effects that we have on the sustainability of other countries and other regions is not really something that European politicians like to look into too much. So that's another area where we're quite busy. And I guess a third one is that, and it's also about policy coherence, I guess, is that on the one hand, we have this European Green Deal with all these great objectives, and we welcome these, and the objectives are very good, but they look better on paper than, you know, the answers that they're putting on the table now. And one of the big kind of blockers or problems is that we are still stuck in our, let's say, traditional economic model, which is so much focused on economic growth as the main driver and as the main indicator of whether we're successful or not. And even the European Union's own environmental agency, the EEA, has said that we will not be able to reach our environmental objectives if we stick to that growth paradigm. But that hasn't really changed. I mean, there's a lot of discussion now on this, but there's still, let's say, very conflicting political interests. So I would say for us, from our perspective, the glass is definitely half full and not half empty. It's very exciting times for us as an environmental organization, but the fight is far from being won. So there's a lot of work for us in, I guess, in the coming years.
Thank you. Now, what is hovering behind a number of the responses here is the potential in the field of environmental policymaking and of discussions about sustainability to have a lot of talk. And the question then is, where's the action? Where are the results? Where are the changes that need to take place? That's a problem in diplomacy. That is a problem on all levels. And so I want to go back here to our grassroots university level and turn to Nora Grosse again. And I want to take the audience and Nora back to the year 2019, when the Free University declared a Klimanotstand, a climate emergency, and students were very active in pushing for this. My question is, Nora, from the point of view of the unit where you work, where does the symbolism behind something like that stop, and where do the actual actions that are successful and effective come in? Because the Free University was the first university in Germany to declare such a climate emergency. It reminds me a little bit when I was a graduate student in Berkeley in California. Students on campus had decided that Berkeley was going to be a nuclear-free zone. And there was a lot of debate about this, but also some humor. Of course, what is one town going to do being a nuclear-free zone all of a sudden? What does that really mean beyond any kind of symbolism? So Nora, my question to you would be, what was this Klimanotstand, this climate emergency, all about? And what concrete effects can we say did it have, even on the institutional level?
Yes, I'll be happy to answer this question, because indeed, actually, the climate emergency declaration, that we passed in December 2019 is really the guiding principle for our actions since then. So basically, we have 7 main points that form the declaration, and I think some of them are quite radical. For example, to take sustainability into account in all of the university's decisions and planning, to comprehensively anchor sustainable development issues in teaching, which is also my task, and also to achieve climate neutrality by 2025. So obviously this is a very ambitious goal that we set ourselves. For the university, of course. And then, there are like several perhaps more conventional goals, which we have been doing anyway. For example, to make sustainability issues and activities more visible within the university, and also to integrate them into our international networks, and to report regularly in a sustainability report about our progress. And a rather new element is also to develop an idea and innovation management that should also help in achieving climate neutrality. So to make this perhaps more tangible for the audience, our idea is really to make the institution, even more than it now is, a place for innovative ideas and research contributions in the field of climate protection, resource conservation, biodiversity, etc. And really to make it a space of empowerment, research and teaching opportunities, and especially I think the term living labs or experimental spaces is quite important here. And we also have the idea of actually trying to develop carbon offsetting projects on campus. And actually, for instance, there's already one project going on in cooperation with the Botanical Garden, which basically is about like vegetable charcoal. I don't know if the audience is familiar with this, but it's basically trying to use the university's biological waste that is coming from trees, from shrub cuttings, but also from the veterinary medicine, from the horses, for example, through like carbonizing this. And this creates a very fertile soil and can be used as fertilizer. And it can also be used, like the heat generated in the process can be used to heat buildings. So actually, the recent study showed that this technology, if it can really be implemented in a large scale on campus, but also beyond, could also help us to offset about half of our flight-related CO2 emissions, so flights from business trips that are also part of our CO2 emissions. So yeah, I think this is, just to give a kind of a glimpse of the activities that we've planned. And of course, we also want to enlarge our renewable energies. We already have photovoltaics on campus, but that can also be expanded. Greener gas for heating, and also, in terms of mobility, we would have the aim of, for example, switching the whole university's vehicle fleet to e-mobility, and also supporting biking and other more sustainable forms of transport. So yeah, that's just one of or several examples of how we really try to implement the climate emergency declaration beyond symbolism.
Thank you. This is really helpful because it shows that when concrete, measurable steps are decided upon, and not necessarily ambitious, big things that might be hard to achieve, but things like e-mobility and so on, that there are measurable results. And that, of course, is then encouraging for further steps, and perhaps also pulls some of the skeptics on board who might initially be doubtful about the whole enterprise. I want to turn to that question also of going beyond talk and doing specific things to engage in actions by turning to Heike Mewes again in the business field. Heike, you do a lot of training and teaching in this field. Let's imagine that I were to come to you and I say, okay, I want to start a business, a startup business, and I'm going to ask you to come and advise me on concrete things I need to consider, steps I need to take, things I need to have in mind when I want to apply sustainability as a principle to my business design. What are the things that you're going to tell me to look for and to think about, to put into a business plan to achieve that element of sustainability? How would you do your consulting?
Well, I would first of all start out by clarifying kind of what focus to take on. So integrating sustainability really means looking in all aspects of your business to what are your negative impacts, environmental, social, financial, economic impacts, what are your positive contributions, and how can you reduce or design your business model in a way that these negative impacts are minimized as much as possible and the positive contributions will be maximized. And to do that, of course, that's very generic. You will have to understand what are all these components of a business and what do you have to look into. So starting a business, most people have mostly in focus the product or service they want to make available, or the problem. If you start more from like a vision and mission perspective, which problem do you want to solve? And from a sustainability perspective, it would be fantastic and kind of like a strong sustainable business model if you've put a solution to an ecological or social problem into the center, let's say, of your business, so you can think about what contributions to the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, or to specific sustainability issues your product or service can have. And the other thing then is, one is this value that you create for your customers, for the planet, for society, is how do you produce that value? And so you will have to think about what products or what materials are you using in your production? What resources do you need? And who are your partners? What maybe sustainable partners along the long supply chain that you might need? How can you organize and integrate sustainability there? And then how will you get the stuff that you produce to your customers? And who are your customers? Who do you want to reach? Who do you want to serve? What needs do you want to really meet? And how can you maybe find a need that is really, let's say, yeah, not just a luxury, but maybe a basic problem that you're solving. And delivering these things also means what kind of transport do you offer? How about also the effects of your products and services after they have been used? Can they be reused? Can they be recycled? Can they be turned into something else after their first life, let's say? And so there's along the whole, let's say, life cycle of a product and service, you would need to consider social and environmental concerns, look at the costs that you affect in economic terms, but also in environmental and social terms, and the revenue that you generate for the business, but also for people and the planet. And in doing so, there's very many helpful tools that you can use as a business, as a startup. There's canvases where you can, like on a board, sketch these various elements of a business model and kind of fine tune and see how this works out. If you redesign a little the idea of your product, maybe you have a better chance to work with sustainable suppliers. You have a better chance to have this product being reused or recycled in the future, and you can kind of play with designing the various facets of your business model.
I would assume that one of the big obstacles in this kind of consulting is that you might encounter business people whose bottom line is going to involve cost and profit. And you need to then come with arguments to overcome that. What's your experience in that regard?
That is actually really the usual case with established companies. So in a startup setting where you maybe even start out with a sustainability focus or want to contribute a good solution to these multiple crises that we face through a business model, that might not be too much of a challenge, but you have to find a business model that is also, amongst others, financially sustainable. And it's a bit different if you work with established companies that have been running for quite some time, that maybe also have a financing structure, publicly owned shareholders that want their dividend at the end of the year, that want a certain growth strategy to persist, to go on. That is a different setting, where the first step really is to help the company understand why should you do that? And the why is really manifold. And there is also a lot of why about the potential risks and costs involved of not acting on sustainability. So rising energy prices, stricter regulation that's coming up, the reputation, the ability to attract talent, if you don't work on any of these issues, and is already getting worse, for instance. So there's cost arguments associated with, there's also revenue arguments associated with going more into green sector technologies or having solutions that are attractive also from sustainability point of view, can draw new customers to your company. So there's also arguments that tie in with the let's say revenue logic and cost and benefit logic, and there's also other arguments that are less tangible, that are still, however, for many companies coming through about business ethics and also purpose of a company. What do we want to stand for? How do we want to feel about working in this company? So, and this is becoming more and more an issue for many companies, but often it's a process. Starting to really understand why should we do that, understanding what's going on in the world around the company. As I said earlier, the financing sector now is really kind of speeding up on these issues. making requirements stricter on what to report on, that you have to perform, that you have to set targets in terms of CO2 reduction, that you have to show your performance. So there's arguments tying very much into the core business logic that all business people know, so to say, that helps drive this agenda.
Thank you, Heike. Shifting now again to the European, but also perhaps national policy picture. Just with business, again, my last question to Heike dealt with this juxtaposition of cost and profit, and then sustainability, and the compromises that one has to make, or how one needs to be convinced to see this as a positive goal that is going to be compatible with making a profit and having bearable cost in the company. Turning now to policy making, Anja Anzigia, on the national as well as European level, the juxtaposition often is that involving sustainability, environmental concerns on the one hand, and economic growth. Perhaps increasingly also under the current circumstances, with the desire to make sure that we don't end up in a very deep recession or deeper than it already has become, to do things to push economic growth, to get the economies nationally and European-wide moving again. How, in terms of your perspective on policy making on the national and European level, how do these two forces interact? This desire, perhaps also political push and pressure to generate economic growth, and then the environmental concerns, the pursuit of sustainability.
Oh, yes, indeed. That's a very, very good point. And actually, for a long time, there was this idea that there is a contradiction between economic growth and sustainability or environmental protection. Now it should actually be much more perceived or asked what kind of economic growth we're talking about. If the growth is only about industry development and only specific industry, if we're talking about, conventional steel, reliance on fossil fuels, and if this is the economic growth that certain policymakers in the US in the past and in Poland currently have in mind, and obviously this economic growth cannot take place at the same time with sustainable development. But the majority of the growth that we actually can create, and that's actually happening, is in the area of green technologies, in the area of services. If we're going to cinema one day again, we obviously contribute to economic growth, but the emissions are minuscule. They're coming from the electricity consumption, and soon electricity should be clean, should be zero carbon, because electricity is actually the easiest to decarbonize, and this is where we in the EU doing quite well. Should be doing better, as Patrycja mentioned, but we're going in the better direction than we've been. So it's much more about what kind of growth we're going to generate, and especially after the pandemic, and also generation of wind turbine, production of wind turbines, solar panels, energy efficiency measures. This all contributes to economic growth, and but we do have again this focus on traditional growth above everything else, which is obviously not the whole idea of quality of life. On the other hand, working for climate ethics, we're also looking at developing and least developed countries, and in those places, going there and saying, you have to slow down economic growth, and this will just not work. So the idea is to skip fossil fuel age if you're not there yet. So that's one of the other lessons learned. So that economic growth, first of all, has to be shaped well. It's not growth above everything else, no matter what kind of growth we're talking about. And secondly, without rational and focus on sustainability, there will be no sustainable growth or long-term growth. I mean, we also have to do environmental protection for the sake of growth, because we cannot rely on fossil fuels in the future as well. So this contradiction of prioritization of growth above sustainable development or above natural protection will just not work in the long term. So this is so just to summarize, there is no contradiction between growth and sustainable development. But we have to keep in mind what kind of growth we're talking about.
Thank you. Patricia, you're in the same sort of European policy boat with the Environmental Bureau. Take us into the lobbying kitchen, so to speak, of the Environmental Bureau. The issue as addressed by Anja Antigia, the question of the push for growth, but the compatibility with sustainable development. How does an NGO like the one where you work, how does it specifically try to impact policymaking in Brussels? Is it a matter of setting up meetings in directorates general, in the bureaucracy and the bureaucracy of the European Union? Does it mean lobbying members of parliament? What specifically are some of the ways in which your organization tries to impact policymaking?
Yeah, sure. I mean, a lot of super interesting things have been said, so I'll also try to relate a little bit to what the other panelists have said before getting to this very concrete question. From our perspective, I mean, going a bit back to what Heike has described, how the context and from the business perspective has changed. I would definitely agree with her that I mean, there has been a quite a substantial change in the whole discourse on sustainability, and it has really developed from from an add-on or something voluntary to something that you have to do as a successful company these days, no matter what size of the company, no matter what sector you're in. So that's definitely a very interesting and important development in the last 20 years or so. I would totally agree with that. From our perspective, of course, our role being, being very critical watchdogs, of course, what we do see is that if we also go back to the idea of the SDGs and the numbers that you have showed about countries and how aware people about the SDGs. I mean, there's similar studies about companies, how aware are businesses in different sectors of the SDGs. What research has shown is that especially larger, I mean, medium-sized and large companies are very much aware of the SDGs, and as Heike has described, I mean, they're used widely also in kind of sustainability accounting and reporting, etc. So that's all very good. But what we also see is that what happens still a lot is so-called Sdg Cherry Picking. So companies, will pick the aspect of sustainability that is easy for them to reach. So I'm just sharing one example that I encountered in another panel discussion with a major fossil fuel company that was bragging about, how much they do in SDG 5 and gender equality because they promote more female engineers, but as a fossil fuel company, your sustainability problem, your major sustainability problem is maybe not necessarily with gender equality, but obviously another one. So there is this SDG washing, which is kind of the new greenwashing. Which is going on quite a bit, which also brings us back, to how you framed the discussion today. Is it just a buzzword, or is it more? So there is still a bit of quite a bit of that going on, and a lot of NGOs are quite wary of that and also question the whole concept of the SDGs because it's been used for SDG washing quite uncritically, and governments as well do a lot of SDG washing. I mean, just look at all the SDG reports that the German government or any other government produce. They all read very, very well, and but they're not necessarily addressing all the major challenges that we have. And I mean, to come back to the question that you asked about, a concrete example of how we work. So I mean, the whole discourse that was just described about, the clash between sustainability and economic growth is one that we're quite, active in, and we work on. The reform of the economic governance of the EU, and one specific issue that we're working on at the moment is the possibility of getting a new European directive in place on due diligence, which means that companies would be obliged to do much more analysis and research into the negative impacts that they can have on the environment and human rights across the supply chains, across the value chains. It would become obligatory. Now it's quite voluntary, but it would become more obligatory. There could even be a liability for companies, a civil liability for companies if they don't analyze enough and respond to these risks. There could be a risk in the future for companies that victims of negative environmental impact or human rights violations could come to European courts, to a German court, to a French court, and even claim damage payments. So that's a very exciting new legal development at the European level that we're quite involved in. And of course, this started many, many years ago, really with campaigning, awareness raising, petitions, working with networks, also with trade unions, social justice organizations. I mean, we also, as an environmental organization, this whole sustainability work, of course, also forces us outside our environmental bubble. I mean, we have to work with the young people's movement, with trade unions, etc. And now we're at a stage where this European Commission has promised us a new legal proposal on this question of due diligence. So, of course, what we do as NGOs is, once we have set this thing on the agenda, we contributed to a consultation that the European Union has organized on this. Of course, we're having meetings with the experts in the Commission working on the legal proposal. At the same time, we continue campaigning and awareness raising and, keeping up the pressure, because, of course, business associations and the business lobby is not particularly happy about this, potential new development. So, of course, there's also a lot of resistance against these new kind of regulations that we need to encounter. But we also need to encounter that, not just with public pressure and communication and campaigns, but of course also with scientific proof and very sound arguments. So our work is quite varied. But it takes us to meetings with members of parliament and the experts in the commission and other stakeholders, also finding, business stakeholders who agree with us that this kind of regulation is necessary. And that's maybe my last point on that question, is that from our perspective, you showed this slide at the beginning, the kind of the multi-level approach. Of course, we all agree on that, and it needs individual commitment, it needs a commitment from business, but what it needs in the first place is better regulation of the context in which businesses and we as a society can operate. So a lot of the things that Heike has described, that, they consult companies to do, the legal framework that we have doesn't really encourage companies or support them enough to do these things. So just one example. Why do we have to pay a very high rate of value-added tax on repair jobs? Why can it not be zero? Why can repair not be cheap? Because we take away the tax on labor and value-added tax on repair. That's just one example. So I think there's so much potential still in putting way better laws and regulation in place that would make it way easier for businesses and companies to become more sustainable and to still be profitable. Because at the moment, there's still too many barriers for them in place. And those who are actually impacting sustainability very negatively, they still have way too many freedoms to do so. And one thing that we're also quite excited about next year. This year it's still a bit on hold, but next year there might be an agreement at international level to start working on a legally binding international treaty to curb plastic production. And that's just another example. Plastic producers still have way too much freedom to put these products on the market. So I guess my argument is that sustainability needs clever and smart regulation and needs to create kind of a landscape for businesses in which being sustainable is the smartest and most profitable thing to do. And I think we're still quite far from that landscape.
Thank you very much. I need to take the audience again down to the local level because we are here at the university, and I want to ask another question of Nora Grosse. One of the things that we hear about here on campus is the notion of higher education for sustainable development, HESD. Tell the audience a little bit about where that concept comes from and how it is attempted to be implemented here at the university. And you have as a particular specialty, as an area of work, the area of teaching and sustainability. So perhaps you can say a little bit more about that. Okay, I'll try to make it short as I'm looking at the clock here.
So HCSD is basically a concept that has been embraced by the UNESCO for years. I can't tell you the exact date now, but I think it's actually within also the broader SDG context, since SDG 5 is to provide quality education for all. And basically, one sub-goal is also education for sustainable development. And well, from my understanding, of course, there's a lot of research on it, and I'm not a researcher in educational science, but the most important thing is to go beyond, the factual knowledge of just trying to be a neutral actor that just transmits kind of objective knowledge, which you don't have, but actually understanding students as citizens, as critical beings who, where the reflectionary competencies should be developed, but also the competencies of designing and creating something where they can actually also increase their self-efficacy in the process and really thereby make themselves or understand themselves as change agents in that process. So how we try to implement that, as I said, it's quite a challenge because obviously every teacher has a different approach. And well, for once, I personally coordinate a competency area that is accessible for all bachelor students at Freie Universität, called Sustainable Development, where students implement projects, sustainability projects, or they actually come up with ideas to, for example, make the campus greener, or also social projects. So this has been going on since 2018, and it's, we get very positive feedback from both the students and the teachers. And that is just, one example that stands out in terms of interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary teaching formats, which I think is one of the integral parts also of higher education for sustainable development. And I think a lot of different formats and methods are, under this umbrella that really, try to go beyond the traditional seminar context.
Thank you very much, Nora. I'm also going to try at this point to integrate some of the comments or questions that we have been getting from our audience. And several of you made reference to this donut concept. Perhaps, Heike, could I ask you to give us your sense of what this concept involves? And secondly, a question for you. There's some question here in the audience about the relationship between the sustainability aspect and the ethics aspect in business. To what extent this is part of the broader question of business ethics. But perhaps first a few words on this donut concept. How widespread is it? Is it just a European concept, or is it more globally applied?
Yes, the donut, I would say, I cannot say for sure, but it has emerged more on a global level. So Kate Rayworth, she's a scholar and economist now working at the universities of Cambridge and Oxford, but she has worked in international development for many, many years with Oxfam, one of the biggest development NGOs in the world. And her concept is really taken up a lot across the world, and a lot also with the United Nations. She has actually put together a lot of discourses about sustainability in this one image. And this donut, actually the shape of a donut, so a circle with a circle, or like a dough with a circle in the middle. This is kind of bringing together these discourses of the social and environmental aspects of sustainability. Our ability to thrive is determined by these ecological ceilings, which make up the outer shape of the donut. And the bottom part of this inner circle donut is actually the foundation that we have to create and assure of social and human rights. access to food, but also political voice, democratic system where we can bring in our needs and fight for justice and things like that, access to education. So this creates a shape of a donut that we can use kind of like as a guide to help us understand where we need to get into. And there's a lot of research about what indicators you can use to define these limits. The ecological limits, we have the term planetary boundaries. These are various dimensions of the ecosystems where there's concrete indicators and figures of target zones that we should not supersede. And the same with the social aspects. There's also key indicators that we can look into, for instance, on gender equality or access to education, that we can use kind of as a compass to see where we are. Are we within the donut or are we outside of the boundaries of the donut? Okay, the ethics question and sustainability, they are closely interwoven. So sustainability, I would say, is always the encompassing concept that integrates also ethical concerns. So if you say sustainability is about the long-term thrivability of a company or of an organization, the long-term resilience, the long-term covering all foundations that the organization needs to survive and prosper over the long term, then ethical aspects and also complying with ethical concerns, of course, is one of the founding blocks of a sustainability strategy. Often these, let's say, compliance issues in terms of ethical behavior, corruption, how you treat your employees, also ethical questions about the, let's say, purpose or the direction of the business. These are more established, let's say, and are very elaborately looked into in the ethics field, which is a bit older and has other research agenda, but it's a huge component also of the sustainability management and sustainability strategy of companies.
Thank you very much. Let me turn for a moment, one more time, to Patricia. Fridays for Future was a prominent movement that erupted several years ago, and then of course the pandemic came. From the point of view of such a prominent NGO involved in social movements, activism on behalf of environmental issues, what is your sense of the state of that movement, Fridays for Future? Has it been just interrupted because of the pandemic, or will it be changed because of what has happened?
Well, I hope it, to some degree, it has only been interrupted. Obviously, this movement has been crucial in allowing for some of the political change that we have seen, at least at a level of European policymaking and also globally. Well, the movement is still there, and even though, of course, less visible on the streets, and hopefully we will soon, be able to kind of have that public space back also for expressing our political views. But the movement is very active and through other channels. But I think apart from, the very practical kind of shift from, the public sphere to an online sphere, I think there's also been another shift, which is, I guess, something that happens to all movements that start from, a grassroots level movement on the streets of people gathering, but also kind of then a certain type of, not necessarily professionalization, but at least to some degree also institutionalization of that movement. So, what we have seen in the last year is that different movements or organizations, are developing out of that movement and also kind of becoming more established in, establishing regular dialogue with policymakers, also at European levels. There's a new network that has been created, to bring the different Fridays for Futures and climate strike movements and youth climate movements across Europe together. and to also be more organized and more coordinated in addressing European policymakers. So that's happening, and also they're very, very successful with it. It's really impressive to see the kind of access they're getting to policymakers is amazing, and it's because of their great work. But also at international level, I mean, the movement has been very good in opening doors. Just now at the UN level, there was another youth climate summit that was very well organized, and where they made sure that doors were opened to address also global environmental policy making. So I think the movement is doing fine, despite the challenges of the current moment. And I also hope that we will see them back on the streets, because of course that physical presence, of course, also made it more urgent for politicians to respond to that. But I would say in general, I see that this movement is still very strong and using its space very, very well.
Thank you very much. I want to turn for a last comment to Anje Anjekia, because I don't think we could end this discussion without taking note of the fact that a new administration has taken office in Washington, D.C., and that there's, of course, a lot of expectation also in the environmental policy field attached to that change. Anje, when you're looking at it from a European point of view, let's look now in a transatlantic direction. In just a few comments, could you sort of depict where you think things may be headed in the next few years in the transatlantic dimension with this new administration?
Well, I mean, there was a huge sigh of relief, obviously, when there was a major change in the administration in the US in the climate scene, and the expectations so far have not been failed, to put it this way. I mean, the goal of the decarbonization of the US power sector, for example, electricity sector, the fact that there will be no natural gas, no coal in electricity generation in the US, for example, according to Biden plan, is well more ambitious than the EU one, and I do expect, I do hope that this will mobilize the EU to catch up on certain areas. The EU has certain, and this is one of the drawbacks of the European policy, and especially German governments and Polish policy. This is where one of the areas where Poland and Polish and German government speak the same language. Sadly, it's support for natural gas. And it is a fossil fuel, and there's still too much money flowing in this direction. And Nord Stream 2 is a complete, political, environmental, and geopolitical nonsense. And keeping this in mind, the US is actually, in this regard, at least planning to get out of fossil fuel completely in the electricity generation sector by 2035. So this will mobilize sources, but at the same time, there is at least the idea that we're not there alone. And obviously, we've never been alone. There are a number of countries which are taking ambitious action. We have especially most ambitious island states, for example, which have been pushing for 1.5 during the Paris Agreement negotiations to reduce the climate warming to maximum 1.5, because otherwise, for them, it's a matter of survival. And many of them are planning to become fully carbon-free in the coming decades. China declared goal of climate neutrality by 2060 as well. So I do hope that there will be a coalition of willing, especially driven by the US, EU, hopefully beyond the next 4 years even, that will drive the decarbonization process globally as well. So a lot of optimism on that front as well, but let's see how things develop.
Thank you very much. And it's always good to end with a note of optimism. We have gone several minutes, as you may have noticed, over our time, and we could keep going on this topic because there's so many angles, as the audience will have noticed, from local to European, and in many, many different aspects, from ethics to policy making and what have you, starting a business, running an educational institution. Sustainability is really something that is touching all of us more and more in different aspects of life. And I want to thank our 4 panelists for having shared their expertise and their experiences, their insights on this topic with us today. And also, of course, want to thank our technical support. I would want to thank the university for making all the equipment and this room available for this event. And to thank you, the audience, for having joined us and to having submitted some comments and questions. We hope that you have gained new insights through this discussion. I want to remind you once again that the recording of this event will be on our YouTube channel. And we have 2 further sessions coming up in the next few months. On April 15th, we are going to have a discussion about the digital revolution, opportunities, challenges, and implications of everything that's happening. And I guess that's also very timely in light of the fact that we're doing so much online, and so many people have screen fatigue and everything else associated with our digital lives. And then on June 17th, we should have a very interesting session called Young Globalization. We are going to be joined by representatives of an organization here in the city that works with young entrepreneurs and other people active in various parts of society. And so the idea is there to look at the role and impact of young leaders in a world that may become more and more post-national in the sense that it's more globally oriented. So if you go to the website that you see there on your screen, /BerlinTalks, you can always find the latest information. With that, again, it is my pleasure to thank the panelists, to thank you, the audience, and to wish everyone good health, and we will see and hear you next time. Thank you and goodbye.